Good evening. My name is Jonathan Judekin. I have the pleasure of coordinating the Communities in Conversation series here at Rhodes College. Some of you may have noticed that in the New York Times, Simon Critchley, a Brit by birth, wrote a brilliant op-ed piece in The Stone. If you aren't familiar with The Stone, I really want to encourage you to familiarize yourself with it. It's a wonderful space in the New York Times for exploring the contemporary relevance of philosophy. And Critchley's piece was called On Election Eve, a Brexistential Dread. In it, he wrote, "We are all living with enormous and ever-rising levels of anxiety. The days pass in a fever of worry, with waves of nausea that subdue only to return and rob us of our breath. Many people are having difficulty sleeping. Many others wake up in fright. What will America look like after Tuesday? What will the world look like?" He went on. The mood of nausea at the world, a disgust at the entirety of our existence, is familiar to those of us who cut our teeth reading existentialist fiction. Novels like Sartre's 1938 Nausea captured a feeling of disgust with the world and disgust with ourselves for going along with a world so seemingly blissfully happy with itself for so long. This is the mood I want to bring into focus by exploring the concept of Brexistentialism. Then he concluded with this: despite the best and noble efforts of the mass movements like Occupy and Black Lives Matter, it is this vision that is missing at the present time and that has to be regained. Recall Albert Camus' incarnation of Sisyphus, condemned to push a huge rock up a hill for eternity. What interested Camus is the moment when Sisyphus returns to his rock, walking downhill, downhillary, to meet it once again. This is the hour of consciousness for Camus, the moment when Sisyphus is stronger than his rock. The point is not to despair, for that is exactly the reaction that people like Trump want to induce in those who oppose him. The point is to push. I couldn't think of better words with which to introduce this evening. Critchley makes patent the relevance of existentialism, which speaks to the core questions of the human condition. Who am I? Who are we? What is my purpose? What do we stand for? How do we make meaning in a broken world? I've spent a career as a professor explicating existentialism and exploring its relevance for our times. So I know that you are in for a treat this evening, because Sarah Bakewell's book, At the Existentialist Café, Freedom, Being, and Apricot Cocktails, is so clear, and her wonderful ability to explicate the ideas of existentialism via a group biography of its main protagonists is incredibly engaging. I know that she's only going to have time this evening to barely skim the surface of what she covers in the book, and so I really want to encourage you, especially if this is your first exposure to these thinkers and these ideas, to pick up her book afterwards, because it really is the best overview out there. And now that moment of, pure self-advertising. Advertisements for myself, to quote another existentialist work. For those students who want to read the Existentialists in much more detail after tonight, please also think about signing up for the class I'm going to be teaching on existentialism next semester. It's cross-listed as Philosophy 360 and History 321. We will range widely and dig deeply, plumbing the depths of the human condition via these fabulous thinkers. For those of you who are visiting Rhodes today from off campus, I'm also going to be teaching a class at the Memphis Public Library next Tuesday from 5:30 to 7:30, which is going to be an opportunity to debrief from this evening and to explore further what is discussed tonight. This is part of the great conversation series that we have been doing with the Hooks Library following these events. It'll be in room L56, so join us there next Tuesday. I want to briefly just indicate the rules for this evening. Every time I make these opening remarks at one of these talks, I ask everyone to please, 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 please turn off your cell phones. And every time I do so, someone's cell phone goes off in the middle of the talk. There really is only one reason to have your cell phone on, and that is if you are tweeting. For those Twitterati in the crowd, the hashtag tonight is hashtag Rhodes Existentialist Café. Sarah Bakewell's talk will be about 45 minutes. We'll follow with about 45 minutes of Q&A. We will conclude the evening's program tonight at about 7:30, and then Sarah Bakewell will be signing books in the foyer, which are for sale. Now, I know that our students are incredibly time-bound beings. It's part of Heidegger's thought to make us aware of the time-bound nature of our existence. And I know that many of you might leave immediately after the talk. I just want to encourage you not to do so. The Q&A, I think, is almost always the best part of any talk. I don't know why many times students end up leaving right after the talk before the Q&A, but to encourage you to stay, I guess I don't have a sample of these really fabulous t-shirts up here that we have. We have some nice long sleeve black t-shirts, Communities in Conversation t-shirts. It's some cool swag for those of you brave enough to put your hands up who are students and get in on the conversation. So stick around and do that. There are a number of people I want to thank who made this evening possible. First of all, Bonnie Whitehouse and Brianna Summers, and also Jackie Baker. These are the CIC crew who really do all the heavy lifting and who will, Bonnie and Brianna will be bringing around the mics. They've also got little coupons that they'll hand to each student. So please trade that in and pick up one of those t-shirts. None of what we do, however, would be possible without the support of Rhodes Lecture Board. There are also a number of departments on campus that sponsored tonight's talk. The Department of Philosophy, Modern Languages and Literatures, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and most generously, the Search Program. So without further ado, let me turn over the mic to the Director of Search, Jeff Bakewell, who will formally introduce Sarah Bakewell. Thank you for being here.
Thank you all. Good evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Jonathan for those remarks. I don't have a lot to add, and because this is sort of an existential moment, I'm just going to forget that he said any of them. So it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Sarah Bakewell of England. In addition to having an intriguing last name, she was raised in a dresser drawer, at least in part, and as she notes, that was part of what taught her to think outside the box. It was perhaps this attribute that led her to philosophy, to toppling boxes of tea bags, and to cataloging and curating early printed books. She comes to us today as a public intellectual of the first order, having published 4 books to substantial acclaim, both critical and popular. In her crime novel, The Smart, she forges connections between aristocratic and underworld London in the 18th century. In her biography, The English Dane, she tells the story of Jorgen Jorgensen, whose tempestuous life took him to sea at 14, and thence to Iceland and Tasmania, where he both founded the colony and later returned as a convict. In How to Live, A Life of Montaigne, she sinks her teeth into the first truly modern essayist. You can laugh at that if you want to. And today she will entertain us at an existentialist cafe of her own making, serving up a heady mix of freedom and being, garnished with the lives of Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and their friend Raymond Aron. As for the apricot cocktails, you got to get them yourself later. So without further ado, Sarah Bakewell.
Well, thank you very much indeed for those introductions and for inviting me here, and especially thank you very much to all of you for coming along this evening when I know there's a lot else to think about and it's a particularly existential evening. But I want to start by taking you out of 2016 and whisking you back to a truly nauseating experience. Jonathan was talking about nausea before, and the truly nauseating experience is drinking an apricot cocktail. I don't know if any of you have ever tried one. I've been obliged to try quite a few as part of my research into this, and I have to say that some are better than others, but they're not, particularly to my taste. They're very sweet, but they're very, they're quite stylishly served in those glasses. So the story begins in late 1932 or early 1933, but it was sometime over that winter break. And there was a table with 3 people sitting around it, and they were drinking apricot cocktails. They had all come back to Paris from elsewhere. Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, who had been going out together for about 3 years, were not actually able to be together all that much because although they came from Paris, they were both school teachers in other parts of France, so they only got to come back and catch up with each other occasionally. So there they were, and the third person was an old school friend of Sartre's, Raymond Aron. And he had just come back from Berlin. I'll just, in fact, show you a picture of Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir around about the time they met. That's about 1929. They're in a shooting gallery in a fair, and the idea was that as you pulled the trigger, it released the shutter on the camera so that it automatically took a picture of you at the instant of firing. And nevertheless, Sartre manages to continue to look vaguely cool with his pipe. So that's when they met, and a couple of years after that, here they are in this cafe. And so Aron, who had just come back from Berlin, where he'd spent a year studying at the French Institute there, was enthusiastically telling the other two about a new philosophy that he'd encountered while he was in Germany, a new method, and it was called Phenomenology. And he was explaining this to them, he was telling them about it. They, according to Simone de Beauvoir's account of it, they had only vaguely really heard of it, not really heard of it before at all. And he was telling them, we don't know what he was telling them, but I think he was probably telling them something about how it worked, and how it worked, kind of very long story, very short, is that you, instead of starting philosophy with the usual process of starting with axioms and then trying to figure out what followed from that in a series of deductions or sort of numbered points that all focused on how we can be certain of what we know and topics like that. Phenomenology started with kind of setting all of that aside and just describing what we're experiencing it as we're experiencing it, phenomena, so appearances, things as they appear to us. And that gives a new starting point for philosophy. So this, as Aron expressed it, was, you see, my little friend, mon petit camarade, which he'd always called Sartre since they were at school, if you're a phenomenologist, you can talk about this cocktail and make philosophy out of it. And this single idea was so enormously exciting that Sartre went racing off to the nearest bookstore and basically demanded, give me everything you've got on phenomenology. They produced one slim volume, which was by Emmanuel Levinas and was an introduction to the certain aspects of phenomenology. Sartre read it in such a rush to get into it that he read it without getting a paper knife to open the pages, which you still had to do at that time. He just tore them open as he walked down the street and read. And then he managed to get himself transferred to Berlin as well, to take up the same studentship that Aron had had. And he spent a year in Berlin, and he came back with a very different sort of a philosophy, really. It was based on the method of phenomenology, but it was had a very different flavour to it. It was sort of based on, yes, on the experience of drinking cocktails, and also on the waiters who served them, the cafes where you sit, the angle that the Parisian waiter bends just so as he's serving the cocktail, the whole performance of that, the people that you might be having the cocktail with and what your relationship with them could be, whether they might be lovers or friends, or you might desire another person, or you might be revolted by them and they desire you, and you know, this whole interplay of relationships. In other words, there was an awful lot about sex in Sartre's version of it, which was conspicuously absent from the phenomenologists of Germany. But it became very popular. Can't imagine why that could possibly be. And this is Sartre at a fairly early stage of his career. He went on to develop the consequences of this great revelation that he'd had, and developed it through the 1930s, and this novel, Nausea, which Jonathan referred to, of course, was published in 1938, made him reasonably famous. But then came the war, and during the war he further developed his philosophy, and culminating in Being and Nothingness. And by the time the war had ended, he had become incredibly famous, really, what with one thing and another, what with novels and plays and vast philosophical volumes. And it was a different world by the time he emerged from the war. And I think the scene that most captures just how famous he'd become, well, I mean, you know, you can look at the existentialist milieu that became very famous in Paris when everybody was dancing in nightclubs until dawn and listening to jazz music, which had been forbidden during the years of occupation. Staying out until dawn had been forbidden, there'd been a curfew. So there was this great liberation, this great sense of anything is possible, and now we can do what we want to do. But in the middle of sort of those years of immediately after the war, in 1945, Sartre gave a public lecture under the title in French it's Is Existentialism a Humanism? It's translated as Existentialism is a Humanism. And it attracted so many people unexpectedly that chairs were overturned and people fainted in the heat and passed out and jostled each other. Kind of no tickets were sold because you couldn't get to the ticket desk to buy them, so everybody just piled in. And because of the chaos, the police were called and medical services were called. And it was such an incident that the Time magazine even picked up on it and published a picture of Sartre, not that one, but sort of quite kind of similar, and with the caption, "Philosopher Sartre, women swooned." So he became this huge star. And in that lecture, he did various things. I mean, I imagine many of you will know it and will have come across it if you've read any Sartre. And it's sort of, well, it starts from a slightly odd angle, kind of defending existentialism against some of its enemies, and then presenting some of the basic ideas of it. But one of the key, it culminates in a story about a former student of his who had come to him during the period of the war, seeking advice on what to do. He had, in his family, his father had sort of gone over to the collaborators' side. His brother had been killed, and that left just the student and his mother. And his mother really needed his company and support and for him to be there. But what the young man really wanted to do was to go off and join the Free French forces abroad, escape, and fight for his country and get revenge for his brother and sort of do better than his father. So he had sought, but of course doing that meant abandoning his mother and very dangerous and difficult circumstances. He was so unsure what to do that he's sort of thought of seeking advice from the usual sources of certainty or help with that kind of difficult choice, or authority really. So he thought about, should I talk to a priest? But then he didn't really trust the priests. I mean, some of the priests had taken up, not all of them of course, but some had taken a position that was sympathetic to the regime. In general, he didn't feel that they could help him with this. He thought about turning to the philosophers that he'd studied at school, but none of the philosophers could help with this kind of dilemma. It was all too abstract. It didn't help him to decide what to do. And then he thought of turning to Sartre. But of course, the one thing he must have known about Sartre was that he wouldn't get a straightforward answer. He wouldn't get, an easy solution telling him what to do. And in fact, the answer that he got from Sartre was, there's no, I can't tell you what to do. You are free to choose. So choose. You have to decide. It's just up to you. You have to choose. But just bear in mind that it really matters what you choose, because in choosing, you should choose as if you were choosing for all humanity. So with that comforting thought in mind, go away and just make up your own mind what to do in this impossible situation. And there Sartre kind of leaves us, in this lecture. So it's really quite bizarre. It goes to the heart of what Sartre was talking about with his ideas of radical freedom at that point in his philosophy. And this was a message that, of course, it didn't offer any help with anything. It didn't make anything any easier. It didn't provide guidance. It didn't comfort. It didn't really bestow the benefit of any wisdom, apart from the fact that it just made it utterly conspicuous that the basic thing about freedom is that you're free. And therefore, because you're free, you're also responsible for what you do. And for Sartre, he meant that at that period in the most radical way imaginable. There are no excuses, there are no comforts. So it's a pretty stark philosophy. But it's actually also, potentially it's a very exciting philosophy, because it means it actually is up to you what you can do. It is up to you what you can make out of your life. So that message had a tremendous, I don't know if appeal is the word, it just had a galvanizing effect in the years after the war, when after all of these old, just like with the student, all the old sources of authority had been thrown into question, had really lost their sense of substance, had lost their sense of being a solid rock that you could guide your life by. So there was something missing, but there was also the other side of it, the sense of possibility. So, you can create a different kind of world, was the feeling. Not only that, you have to create a different kind of world. So it's this strange mixture of pessimistic, optimistic. In the aftermath of the war, of course, there was this, particularly after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki explosions, there was a sense that you actually had to live up to that kind of freedom. I mean, both Sartre and also Albert Camus wrote essays saying, if, from this moment on, the human race knows we have the power to destroy ourselves. Therefore, at each day from now on, we have to decide whether we're going to live. So that's an existential choice, if ever there was one. And Sartre would have probably said, just as he said to the student, well, I can't tell you what to do, you have to go ahead and do it. So the origin of this in his own sort of genealogy of himself is very personal, very interesting. He wrote in his autobiography words, which again, I imagine some of you might have read. It's a really, actually very enjoyable read, I might add, if any of you haven't. It's a kind of ironic and quite strange account of his own childhood. But he tells us there that he sort of, how he became the person that he was partly because of his very early experience. When he was 3 years old, he looked like that. He was a very pretty little thing. And he knew he was a very pretty little thing, because everybody in the family adored him and doted on him, and they knew that he was very clever and he would sort of perform his cleverness, and everybody loved him. And then a couple of terrible things happened. One was that he caught an infection which robbed him of the sight pretty much in one eye. He had very partially sighted in one eye, and it also caused that, which when you see pictures of Sartre is very distinctive. You can see that one of his eyes is completely non-aligned with the other. But in that eye, the one that is not aligned, or the one that swivels outwards, he had very, very little vision. And so there was that. But he also, his grandfather took him for a haircut, and so all these curls, which had sort of covered up some of his less attractive features, disappeared, and suddenly the full horror of Sartre was exposed to the world. And he was traumatized by it, because he suddenly had this sense of himself as being ugly. This was the word that he used of himself all the time, his ugliness. He was, as he grew older, he went to a new school, which was a very different kind of a school. It was much tougher, really. There seemed to be a tougher kind of social relationship between the boys there. He certainly was immediately picked on and singled out. He felt, because of his ugliness, just because he didn't fit in, I guess, he was bullied. He was horribly bullied. And he felt, humiliated and out of control of what was happening. He speaks in interviews about this, that he decided one day that he was going to just take charge of the situation. So the situation when he was being bullied was that, the bigger boys would come and take his lunch away from him, take his food away from him, beat him up, sort of take away whatever he had, steal it. And so he got the idea of seizing control by stealing some money out of his mother's purse, which made him feel, because it was theft, it was sort of quite transgressive, I guess, stealing some money, using it to buy cakes, and then going in and giving away the cakes to all the bullies in the school. And he described this as being the moment where he discovered violence. It's like the liberating quality of violence. So I don't know how bad the cakes were, but it's an act of violence. It seems quite strange, but I think what he was getting at was, again, that thing about freedom and control. He felt that he had taken control of the situation in a very individual way. He'd made it his own. He'd taken ownership of it. And later, when he's working out his theory of freedom, I think there's a great sense that there are all the things that happen to you in the world. There are things that you can't control. There are the things that it all forms part of your situation, was the word that he used. You can't change those, but what you can do is change, obviously, what you do about it. Sometimes you can't even do much about that. You can change what you make of it. You can kind of make it your own. You can change the way that you live it or experience it. And so it set up in him this real sense of freedom as like some kind of, there's the world, there's your body, there's the things that happen to you, things that happen around you, events, influences of all kinds, but you're always free because you're always one step ahead of that. It's up to you what you make of it. So it's quite a stark, it's quite a stark sort of contrast, and it's quite a strong image of control. Meanwhile, Simone de Beauvoir, who was also there in that Apricot cocktail conversation and was also fascinated by phenomenology, she had looked like that when she was a girl, and now she was a person who also had her own way of taking control in her youth. She basically applied herself to an absolutely dedicated degree of studying. She read with this incredible energy. She worked so hard to get herself to a good school, to pass exams, but also just to read vast quantities herself. And she saw that as her way of escaping a sort of bourgeois girlhood, where there was a lot of emphasis on deportment and wearing nice clothes and being modestly behaved, and all of those pressures that affected girls much more than they did boys. And she got out of that or she to some extent got out of it, but she escaped it by studying and applying herself particularly to philosophy, which she excelled in. And so sort of fast forward through all of that, she became a philosophy student, met Sartre, became a philosopher, and her most famous book, as many of you will be aware, concerned exactly that, the experience of growing up as a girl. The Second Sex, published in 1949. There she is, looking a bit more as she would have done at that time, was largely about, well, it was really about two things. It was about how growing up as a girl, as an individual, is a completely different experience from growing up as a boy. And she traces the life story of a girl. It was a kind of composite experience of a girl growing up from early infancy to the time when boys are running around and, getting dirty and climbing trees and getting scabs on their knees and tearing their clothes, falling in the mud. And girls don't do that because of exactly that. They have to worry about their pretty dresses and worry about whether they look nice. There's this sort of habit that's set up very early on of seeing yourself through the eyes of the other. It's a highly philosophical analysis, highly existential analysis, because it's about how you sort of try and be free, but there are all these things that are constraining you. And the other half of the book concerns really all of the same things, but on a vast historical scale and a cultural scale and a social scale. So it's a massive tome which became extremely influential, both when it was published in French and then when it was translated into English, had huge impact, particularly here in America. And her version of how the freedom and the situation plays out is really it was very similar, but it's very different in a way too, because she explores the way in which, yes, we are trying to be free, but always being kind of held down by a situation, but not really quite that opposition that Sartre has, because what she recognises, I think more than he does, is, although he does to some extent, but I think she is far more nuanced in her perception of it, is the fact that also becomes who we are. So there's all these things that are moulding us or keep sort of restraining us we're back to thinking outside the box again, but in the sort of boxing us in maybe to some extent. The social influences, biological influences, historical influences, the things that happen around us, and our genes and hormones and our family background, our childhood, all of these things stop us from being 100% free, but they are also the thing that we are. They become, to a large extent, what we are. I am that person. And she'd written, slightly before that, she'd written an essay called The Ethics of Ambiguity, which is not as well known as The Second Sex, but again, I don't know whether any of you have come across it. I expect some of you have, but it's an essay that really it culminates in that image of the ambiguity of the human condition. So that's the human condition. On the one hand, it is what we are, to strive to be free. On the second hand, I think there's going to be three hands here. On the second hand, there's all of the things that that constrain us in all sorts of ways. And on the third hand, there's the fact that you can't resolve that ambiguity. You can't. They contradict each other, but you can't actually settle it one way or the other, because that constant ambiguity of we can't be free, but we always want to be free, we always strive to be free, is the human condition. So that is sort of their philosophy of freedom. Another philosopher who is one of the many really that come up in the book, but he tends to be much less well known, but I'm particularly an admirer of his, is Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Again, I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but he also, like Simone de Beauvoir, wrote about the human condition in a similar way, because he writes about, again, that fact that we can't, we're not just abstracted minds floating around. We're not completely free bubbles that can just sort of drift one way or the other. We are the complex texture, sort of the weave of things that go into making me what I am here and now, including the fact that I have a body, that I'm aware of leaning on this lectern. I have a sense of where my arms and legs are. I'm aware of you, of all of you sort of being out there kind of listening to me, and the social context, this is a very strange social context, giving a lecture and being listened to, but it's one that we're familiar with. So the social world, the body, perception, the senses that are constantly feeding into my experience of this. And most interestingly, and again, this connects to Simone de Beauvoir and the second sex, most interestingly, he wrote a great deal about childhood, the fact that we are creatures that start off as infants and children. And so many philosophers have written as if we're just adults that are just kind of dropped into the world as if on a thread, and we're perfectly conscious and more or less perfectly rational, but we're completely developed, and then we just go off and have experiences. And that's absolutely nothing like what the human condition is, as we all start off really being, not much of anything, being only very vaguely aware of the few things that we can take in, and then we are socialized, we're surrounded by people who love us and introduce us to the world, and through those experiences we gradually again become what we are. So all of this is I think, a very nuanced portrait of freedom. I mean, the reason that I find it exciting, and I find it particularly exciting in terms of our sense today of what individual freedom as a human being is about, leaving aside political freedom and so on, I'm thinking about the freedom of, am I free to decide what kind of being I'm going to be, what kind of person I'm going to be, what I'm going to do? Well, the answer is clearly yes and no at the same time. It's that strange mixture between the fact that I can't not be free. I mean, it's to be human is to be wanting to control your destiny, but it's more than wanting to. It's actually that Sartre said, I'm free really to do anything except not to be free, condemned to be free. To be free is to be human, to have that sort of always deciding what to do next, always doing something, always deciding how you're going to experience things, or experiencing them, maybe not deciding to, but that is just what it is to be human, is this flood of experience and action all the time in which we're free. But at the same time, there's innumerable factors that condition all of this. For Sartre, if we refuse to acknowledge the freedom, if we only point to all the factors and use them as excuses, then that's bad faith. He calls it bad faith. It's what we all do all the time. I can't really imagine a human being who never did that, who never sort of pointed to circumstances to kind of, give myself a break, or to provide a certain amount of excuse, or just to make things easier for myself. Sartre gives the example of an alarm clock. You set the alarm, and then in the morning you roll out of bed like an automaton, as if you had no choice in the matter. The alarm goes off, you get up. I must say it's an example that doesn't correspond at all to my experience of what I do when the alarm clock goes off. But the principle is there. It's easier to react as though oh, it's time to get up, I get up. Oh, I seem to have got up, okay, I've done it. Than to actually lie in bed thinking, right, do I want to get up? Am I going to decide to be the kind of person who keeps my job and goes off to work? Or much easier to kind of do it without thinking. In technology, there's an interesting example as well of how that works there's a piece of software called Freedom. I don't know if anybody's ever used it or come across it. There's other similar ones too, but it's this absolutely crazy thing, but I use it myself, where when you're on the computer, if it's connected to the internet, you're absolutely free to spend the entire day watching videos of kittens and it's surfing the social networks. But you don't really want to do that. So what's the problem? Why can't you just decide not to? Just decide to get on with preparing your lecture or writing your book instead of surfing the kittens. But somehow it's very, very difficult, because the reason it's difficult is that you would have to make that decision somewhere in the background at every single instant. You would have to keep on constantly renewing that decision. I'm not going to look at the kittens. I'm going to write my book. What Freedom does, you install it, you set it, you block yourself off the internet for an hour or 2 hours or 6 months or whatever it is you want to do. And suddenly there's this great sense of, it's all taken care of. In fact, it's not. You can turn it off and reboot your computer, but somehow it just takes away that burden of freedom for a while. And you can pretend to yourself that it's the computer that won't let you surf the internet. So there's this funny thing where then you're paying for access to the internet, and then you're paying more because you have to pay for this software to block yourself from using it. But there's something about the human condition that seems to make that actually a very successful product. So that says it all. Technology, I want to just touch, this is a bit of a strange segue, but I do want to say a little bit about Heidegger. Heidegger was one of these, as again, a lot of you will know and others won't, one of these phenomenologists that was so influential on existentialism, but also, developed his own brand of existentialism. There's a certain amount of debate, was he an existentialist or not? It was his early work, among other things, that had a great impact on Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. In his later work, he talked a great deal about technology. There's an essay called The Question Concerning Technology. It was a lecture, actually, I think, and an essay. And what he says there is that we have to think differently about technology, because we kind of think as though we're just human beings, and the technology is some sort of, we've got the tools that we have, we've got this, we've got the lights, he didn't have anything like this. He tended to be talking about things like typewriters and agricultural harvesting machines, because that was the technology of his time. But what he said, which I think is really coming into its own today, is that the important question to ask about technology is not just what does this device do, or what difference is it going to make in my life, in the sense of, is it going to enable me to do something faster, or to do it more efficiently, or to do it in a more sort of productive way. The question to ask about technology, again, I think this applies perhaps more to some of our technologies than it did to typewriters, but who knows, is what it does to us, what difference it makes to our own way of being in the world. Heidegger's philosophy was all about being in the world. That was his starting point. Human beings don't float around. Again, the same idea. They are in the world. We are in the world. We are technological creatures. We are affected by our technology. We use our technology thinking that we're using it. In a sense, it's also not using us, making a difference to us. It's affecting our being in the most fundamental way. And I think it's extraordinary that he came up with that idea at a time when not many philosophers were writing seriously about technology or thinking about it in that fundamental way. And what he said applies so much more in the days of the internet than it did in his own time, because we're now starting to see how the internet technology, other kinds of technology, all the technology that mediates our being in the world all the time, is almost becoming another one of those things, like the things that condition us, our genes, our hormones, our history, our social situation, our upbringing. It's almost becoming another one of those things that's fundamental to who we are, because we're so seamlessly integrated with so much of it. And in a way that, even Heidegger couldn't possibly have visualized. It's not just a kind of add-on thing. It's not just something that first there's me, and then there's my technology and my use of technology. Especially for people who have grown up with it, digital natives, it is in fact constitutive of what I am. So one of the questions that arises is, for an existentialist, is, well, then what consequence does it have for my existence? How do I have an authentic existence? How am I free and also, using my technology? So I've no idea how the time's going. I'm just going to ask for a time prompt because I don't have a watch. Yeah. We haven't really got hugely onto the question of politics and the activism of these people. That is a picture of Sartre's funeral in April 1980, and it just conveys a sense of, and it's only a snippet of the tens of thousands that turned up to his funeral. If you can imagine sort of zooming in on those faces, those heads, that's actually something that you can do, because online there's a bit of YouTube footage taken from a TV report at the time, where the camera is of course down in the crowd, you can see people passing, you can see the faces of some of those who are attending the funeral. And to me, it creates a big question and a big sense of the impact of Sartre. The sense of the impact is just, you see such a range of people, all ages, all different sort of styles of dress, kinds of people, all many different backgrounds, races. You sense that people had many, many different reasons for being there. And the question is that always comes to my mind is, for each one of those people, what did Sartre mean to them? What did Sartre mean to that person? I imagine quite a lot of the people turned up simply because he was a huge public figure, a kind of national treasure by that stage, and it was a big event. Somebody of the stature of Sartre seemed to... The stature, I mean, his stature literally was sort of not huge, but his stature as a public figure was immense. So it was just, you wanted to be part of this occasion. But I think there would have been many, many people in that crowd for whom, in small ways, Sartre had changed their life, maybe in big ways. So, I think I will leave it there. I'll leave it with that image of what existentialism kind of ended up as. We're looking at an era here where existentialism perhaps had its day in many ways. This was a much later generation than those who had first discovered it to so much excitement. But what I love about seeing that is that I think it tells me that existentialism, yes, it is about the individuals, the lives and the thinking of its creators or the people who are involved with it. But really the meaning of existentialism is about how it spread into everyone's minds in many ways, either overtly or just as a set of kind of subtle influences, or through reading books like Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, for example, taking many of its political ramifications, its personal ramifications, and it really sort of comes into its own when it's read and responded to, negatively, positively, whatever, but taken on by people. And those are just some of the people, I think, who had some sort of reinvention of existentialism within their own minds and their own lives. And I will leave it there, and we'll go to opening it up to anything that you'd like to ask, and we'll see what comes up. Thanks. Thank you very much.
I had two questions. I'll ask the first one now, and if there's time, I'll ask the second one later. At the time of this meeting at the cafe, to what extent were Sartre and the others' thoughts already informed by the works of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche? Because you seem to imply that they're inventing something as opposed to building on something that they already knew.
No, that's a good question, because I didn't get into Kierkegaard and Nietzsche talking about that. Dostoevsky, I guess, too, sort of often cites as an influence. Kierkegaard especially, I think, was, they had read other philosophers. Sartre was looking for something. He described himself as, at that kind of time, as being in search of, at work on a volume of destructive philosophy. Very striking phrase. He was looking for something that was going to dismantle the kind of university that was taught at the Sorbonne and taught at the École Normale, and start again from a radical foundation. So that he'd kind of found some of that. I mean, a lot of the ideas of existentialism, particularly to do with freedom and choice, are there in Kierkegaard. But what comes out with the encounter with phenomenology is a different method. And phenomenology is a method. That's fundamentally what it's all about. It was his encounter with that separate strand, and it was the meeting. I mean, I really see it as a kind of the meeting of phenomenological method, the influence of Kierkegaard, and the influence of Nietzsche, that you've got this kind of, sort of perfect storm that combines. But it's also interesting that the foundation myth is very definitely, has a quality of myth about it, which I've borrowed for this, but it comes from Simone de Beauvoir's account, and she presents this story as if they'd never heard of phenomenology before, but they pretty clearly had. In fact, Heidegger's essay, What is Metaphysics, had been published in the same journal as one of Sartre's early essays, and she later admitted in her autobiography that they had looked at that and been intrigued about it, but as she put it, because we couldn't understand a word of it, we failed to see its value. So it kind of, it was a slow burn process, but it was a much more complicated process than the story makes it seem. But I guess that's always the way, I think, with foundation myths. Thanks. Any other? What have we got? Oh yeah, there's one. Oh yeah, one there, and then yes. So, yeah.
Okay, I know that Sartre was a Marxist later in his career, and we know about Heidegger's collaboration, and I was wondering, did Sartre ever speak publicly to that? Did he
speak publicly to which? To
Heidegger. Did he ever defend Heidegger as a philosopher or condemn?
Well, he didn't. He certainly didn't defend Heidegger's politics. He was, there are little remarks that show that he was disturbed by it, as so many people were. I mean, the most striking remark that to me that Sartre came out with, because it was echoed by other people, was that Heidegger had shown a kind of absence of character. There was no character. It wasn't that he had a bad character; he had no character, which is such a kind of. I often return to that thought. What does it mean to have no character? And I think Hannah Arendt said something similar. Sartre was very aware, I think, that there was. It was very odd to be writing a philosophy that was influenced by Heidegger during the years of the occupation in France. In fact, Sartre began his first serious reading of Heidegger occurred when he was a prisoner of war, and he got a German copy of Being and Time and read it in the camp. I mean, can you imagine? It seems a very strange thing to do. But that was the moment when he finally understood it. And he actually said that he sort of hadn't understood Heidegger until he understood how Heidegger's writing had come to some extent out of the First World War experience that Germany had had. And as a Frenchman under occupation, he felt a kind of fellow feeling, which is really, you know, I mean, I guess that's as close as you could say to him providing some kind of, you know, fellow feeling with Heidegger on that. But he was deeply influenced by the philosophy without being, I think, ever comfortable with the politics. But he doesn't give us quite enough to go on to be able to say much more than that. He did go and visit Heidegger. There's this, it was a long deferred visit. He was really very, I mean, I find it quite a sort of revealing story, the relationship between them, because somebody else who did visit Heidegger, gave Heidegger a copy of Being and Nothingness by Sartre after the war. And according to various accounts, I mean, Hubert Dreyfus visited and Heidegger and said, "Oh, you're reading Sartre," to Heidegger, and Heidegger said, well, "Nobody can read this rubbish, this dreck." And but yet he kind of seems to have browsed through it, because he wrote a letter to Sartre and said, "We must go skiing together." And there was some reference to Sartre's description of skiing in Being and Nothingness, which occurs right towards the end of it. So that implies that maybe he did read the whole thing. But he invited Sartre to come to visit me in the Black Forest Mountains and we'll go skiing together. And it's just, you have this bizarre image of Sartre and Heidegger flying down a snow-covered slope with Heidegger was a good skier, Sartre not quite so good, but he had been skiing once or twice. But that didn't happen. It became a long deferred meeting, and when finally Sartre did go and visit him, and they talked together, it really didn't go very well. And one of the reasons it didn't go very well was that one thing that Sartre really wanted to talk about was his favorite topic of the time, which was commitment and the need to be engaged and engagé politically. So he ranted on, from what little we know of the conversation, ranted on to Heidegger about how you must get involved in politics, which it was really not the best subject to try and talk to Heidegger about if you were trying to win him over to sort of a productive conversation about philosophy, because that was the one thing that Heidegger himself was extremely reluctant to talk about for reasons which are pretty obvious. He didn't want to have a discussion about that. So it was kind of a wasted opportunity. Yeah, anyway, thanks. Yeah, I think we had one over there, yeah.
First off, thank you for coming to speak to us tonight. Living in a world where Brexit and a Trump presidency have become a reality, and kind of the idea of a collective society as well as our role as individuals, how do you think that philosophy and existentialism have changed in their kind of function in an American and a modern society?
Yeah, I think one of the aspects of existentialism that really intrigues me is how it has continued to have various kind of levels of influence on or importance, but they've changed over time. I think its initial impact had a lot to do with this great sense of like liberation. You don't have to do what the weight of church and state and parents and family have been expecting you to do for generations. You can just go out and spend your, dance all night and wear what you want. And so there was this, great thing about sort of wearing either black turtlenecks or, kind of plaid shirts and snappy dressing and youth culture, in other words. And now that aspect of existentialism, I think, has kind of had its day not because there's no youth culture anymore, quite the opposite. It's because we don't need to justify, if you're young, going out and having and dancing and wearing what you want and expressing yourself and all of that. You don't have to kind of justify it by wielding a copy of Being and Nothingness and saying, look, it's existential. So I think that sort of the individual liberation aspect perhaps has less to offer, but conversely, I think that what's so interesting in Sartrean existentialism is this discussion of freedom and responsibility. The interplay between those two is one thing, and which I talked about kind of a bit in the lecture. But for Sartre, which is kind of implicit towards the end, but I didn't say much more about. But I think this is. For me, this certainly suddenly looms much larger, and I think it will do, is that for Sartre, the big shift that happened to him during the war years was that he moved away from regarding existentialism as a personal, individual matter of individual experience. You know, if you read Nausea, which is kind of earliest in the form of a novel exploration of existential themes, it's really about one man on his own, isolated from those around him, drifting around this town, trying to make sense of being and trying to make sense of himself and his freedom. Once you see Sartre going through the experience of war and occupation, what emerges is suddenly a very different Sartre who is concerned above all with what an existentialist should do and concerned with acting in some way for other people, for the wider world, and the need to get involved and to do something. This concept of engagement, of involvement becomes so crucial for him. It really, it absolutely enormous, sort of almost becomes his central thing. And according to him, it's something that during the war years he discovered a couple of things. He discovered the need to be engaged, that just individual existentialist experience is not enough. And he discovered that we're subject to history, that, things happen and it concerns us. It's not just a kind of add-on effect. There's a big difference in Sartre. When he first went to Germany in 1933, the Nazis had just come to power. For the whole first period that he was there, he barely noticed it because he was so deep in his reading of the Phenomenologists that he kind of didn't really pay much attention to the marches and hideous abuses and events that were going on outside. That changed. That began to change during his residency in Germany, but it certainly changed during the Second World War. So I think certainly, I've been thinking a lot recently about this thing of history really affects you. It's again another one of those things that, as we were saying, it's not just something that kind of, there's me and then there's events that are going on. History, things happening, events in the world are absolutely woven into our very being. And, that's, to me, that's a huge shift, which I think is something that, well, certainly I'm thinking about a lot at the moment. I don't know if that goes some way towards, it's a little sort of a tangential thing, but yeah, it's interesting sort of listening to what Jonathan quoted from Simon Critchley about existentialism, because I certainly, I can relate to that sort of, that portrayal of just trying to figure out this slight sense of disconnection while you're trying to figure out what is going on in the world, what is happening, whatever it is, whether you agree with it or not, whatever your perspective on it, it's momentous. It's definitely momentous. But that sort of, the nausea, the disconnection is not, it's not going to be good enough. It's not going to be enough, So yeah, thanks for raising that. What else?
Me.
Yeah, hi.
Good evening, and
Hello.
thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. I would like maybe to take you back to the 1950s and early 1960s and ask about Sartre's engagement as a public intellectual with the Algerian war, with the responsibility of the French state, and with his identity as a public intellectual.
Yeah, was there any particular angle?
I'm interested in his relationships with Albert Camus, specifically.
Yeah, there's, another person I didn't really get on to talking much about is Camus. They fell out over several interlinked things. By the time the Algerian war was started, I think the seeds of their disagreement were already very much sown. The seeds of their disagreement had actually come out of the Second World War, I think, and the question of how one should respond after after the end of occupation to basically whether it was the question of punishments for those who had been guilty of collaboration. They took a different angle on that. So yeah, I mean, Sartre, as you see him kind of going through the 50s and 60s, you see this process really of him constantly slightly changing direction, but always becoming kind of more and more committed, more and more engaged, to the point that, you know, and it's clearly coming out of, I think, of having his heart absolutely in the right place and wanting to do good and wanting to put into action that engagement side of existentialism so that it actually makes a positive difference in the world. But great deal of uncertainty about which direction it should be going in. So Sartre is constantly sort of flirting with being more radical, with supporting the Soviet Union, with not supporting the Soviet Union, which a lot of the time hated him, with supporting Mao's China, with supporting, you know, sort of a lot of, you know, struggles against colonialism all over the world, which actually I think his sympathy for Mao's China was sort of linked to that. So you get a great sense of this sort of, he's trying to find the right way of applying this great desire to make a difference in the world, but it leads him into some very strange places. Camus, on the other hand, I think has a greater clarity, although when it came to Algeria, it was much more complicated for him, as you know, is well known. He had this sort of famous line about his mother: if I have to choose between defending my mother and defending the freedom struggle, I choose my mother. Well, I mean, the original quote's actually much more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. They were brought into conflict, I think, fundamentally by the particular issues involved, but also by the general principle of whether it's worth making the kind of sacrifices of individual other people's happiness for the potentially much greater good. So it's a classic kind of philosophy, moral problem, really. How do you balance different goods? Sartre was definitely prepared to think that if the world could be changed for the better, then certain sacrifices could be made, though there were always sacrifices of people other than himself. Except not entirely, because he certainly sacrificed his time and his energy to these campaigns that he got involved with. But Camus was, of the opposite persuasion. So, yeah, so their breakup was to do with politics. It was to do with almost the tone in which they addressed one another. It was impassioned. It came at a time when Sartre was almost like desperately sort of felt betrayed by anyone who didn't join him he thought, in sort of working towards this great possible future. So it was very, there were amazing emotions. I mean, people did end up, punching each other on the street. Not Sartre and Camus. That was actually Koestler and Camus. But it was fueled by this great sort of investment. So I guess that's the other side of the engagement thing. It's very personal. That's a very vague answer, but yeah, sorry. I hope that goes some way towards it. Yeah, what else have we got?
Earlier, you touched on how existentialists started to acknowledge kind of the irrationality of people as opposed to the classical philosophers who kind of just ignored that. So I was wondering about how that acknowledgement of our irrationality kind of shaped and influenced existentialist thought specifically.
Yeah, I mean, it goes almost beyond the questions of rationality and irrationality, because it goes to, particularly for Merleau-Ponty and Simone de Beauvoir, but Sartre acknowledges this too. It goes to the question of how we become what we are, how we become the kind of beings that we are, and it's not. They wouldn't see it as, say, Freud saw it as a kind of battle of different levels of our being. So you've got, the kind of irrational subconscious or the id battling with the ego and the conscious sort of ego and the superego that's trying to put it all, force it all into some order. Instead, it's more that the rationality is sort of doesn't really come into it until already a lot of the basic structures of experience are in place. And I think, for me, that is a better reflection of what we are as human beings. But, crucially, I don't think that means that rationality has got nothing to offer, or that the use of reason has got nothing to offer, or that it isn't a part of what it is to be human. It's just that it sort of sits on this bed of many, many other factors that go into making us what we are, and the freedom, this strange freedom thing that's always there as well. But I don't think that rationality is not a part of the equation. In fact, I think it's a vital part of being a human being. It's just that it's not the starting point. I mean, the contrast there would be with Descartes saying that sort of you can strip it all away and start with, okay, what can I know? But human experience is never normally like that. If it is like that, it's a very special case. So, yeah, that's... thanks.
I'm going to make the decision to make that the last question. I mean, you've taken us through Sartre, Beauvoir, Merleau-Ponty, Albert Camus, Martin Heidegger, and we're only beginning to get into the cast of characters that you narrate over the course of the book. It's not an easy thing to try and synthesize a group portrait of what was the most influential body of philosophers and thinkers from the 1930s through the 1960s and indeed beyond, as you say. So I want to thank you very much for, at least for many of us, for this introduction to this wonderful coterie of figures. We thank you, and again, if more of you have questions, Sarah Bakewell will be signing copies of the book outside. So thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.